This is the Ed Non-Tech Podcast, conversations about education, technology, and culture, with Dr. Doug Reed and Dr. Matt Stranick. Thank you for joining us. Hello, welcome everybody. This is the latest edition of the Ed Non-Tech Conversation Series, wherein I get to check in with some educators besides the inestimable Dr. Doug Reed, and as well as checking out various other educational settings, contexts, individuals, and experiences. This kind of doubles, if you will, as a guest lecture for Education 5040 with, and that's on the topic of equity, diversity, and inclusion in education with Dr. Pam Gurney at Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops, British Columbia. So in addition to sort of a regular podcast audience, such as we have on the show, this is actually going out to the students as part of this guest lecture. So really glad to be here and really grateful to be joined by my friend, somebody I've known since middle school-ish kind of years, which I'm sure we'll get into. Dr. Hassan Arif is joining us here. Yeah,
Hi.
really good. Really good to have you here, pal. And really glad you could spend some time speaking to this topic, and also as speaking to your trajectory as a professional and an educator, because you've worn a lot of different hats over the years, from what I can tell, since we kind of fell back into contact through Facebook primarily. So Hassan, I mean, why don't you just tell the audience, I suppose, the students and others who may be listening, what you're up to and what you're about, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, that's like a broad question, but let me see. Well, everyone likes talking about themselves, I guess, so I'll do that. Well, like a bit about, like currently I work in the British Columbia government with the Ministry of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation. I do policy and legislative work with the electricity policy branch. So a lot of working with like BC Hydro and the BC Utilities Commission on policy legislation stuff. I've previously worked in the lands branch in the Ministry of Forests in British Columbia, intergovernmental relations in that same ministry, and before that in public prosecution services in New Brunswick. I've taught the educator side of it. I've sort of been doing the hybrid of the applied and academia, although I'm on a bit of a self-imposed hiatus from academia, but I've taught law and society at the University of New Brunswick, political sociology at the University of New Brunswick, and at the University of Victoria, I've taught urban and regional economic development with the School of Public Administration, and I have an adjunct position there. And I've taught sociology of law at the University of Victoria. And my background is a PhD in sociology and a law degree. And I like, for fun, I like outdoors, like biking. I live in Victoria, British Columbia. I'm originally from Fredericton, so this is a great place. Like the weather's warm here too today, like double digits. So like the mountains, ocean, the forest, oh, sorry, my alarm went off. And did I freeze up?
There was just a moment there, but it's okay. This is one of the things that we're dealing with when it comes to using Skype. We just kind of have a momentary, sometimes a bit of a network freeze. Nothing, I think, that affected what you were saying there. I'll just put it out there that Hassan has been just consistently one of he's just been you've been on a really interesting journey, I think.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, everybody, everybody's thing looks more interesting from the outside, which is part of the social media effect. What I would sort of describe is that we ended up going to Albert Street Middle School together. That was sort of my first recognition of Hassan in sort of a social kind of context. And from there on to Fredericton High School, and then to, as Hassan sort of mentioned, the local institutions of learning. Can I just ask you, when you were sort of getting into your sociology doctoral work, did you have a sense that you were going to do enter law at the same time? Or, I mean, I guess I'm interested in your doctoral journey relative to your journey as somebody who's a lawyer, because I mean that's pretty unique, and we're always interested in bringing new perspectives into this show. So if you could just maybe speak to that part of your journey a bit, that'd be very interesting, please.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah. Academia. Well, I did the law degree before my PhD, but then I did the articling after my PhD. So as for the journey, yeah, that's kind of an interesting one. Like, I mean, honestly, I started my PhD in 2008, and I don't want to be discouraging to academics, but after 2008, just the job market got tougher for academia. And it was more of but I mean, I'm sure if I'd actually put the applications out there, I could have taught at a university and stuff in like sociology or something, or in public administration, public policy. Like, it's one of those things, it's like a lot of life, you kind of don't really plan it out. And I think honestly, just in the course of my PhD in sociology, I did like a lot of the academic and theoretical work, but I was interested in just like the application of it, and kind of, like, I think there's like that important place for theory, to have the concepts and ideas, but then also just kind of to figure out, it sounds a bit cheesy, but how to make the world a better place. And sometimes I think that's harder to do, especially in recent years, but this is not a politics podcast, so I won't get into that. But it's just, yeah, it was kind of that. As I said, there wasn't like a preset plan, but it was a bit of that. And then after I finished my PhD, like I worked at Public Prosecution Services in New Brunswick on appellate litigation and stuff. And so I kind of dropped off wanting to go into academia full time, at least I liked keeping that foot in academia, like teaching, having maybe an adjunct role, like talking to the students, talking to the younger generation, knowing some of the research, talking to other academics. But right now I just feel like there's a lot I can learn working in the applied spheres in government. There's a contribution I can make. And like with any job, it's not perfect. Like I've worked in prosecutions, I've worked in different places in the BC government. You'll have like some supervisors that are better than others, some teams that are better than others, some work that's more interesting and meaningful, other work that's kind of dull. So it's like, I don't want to sort of give like, the Pollyanna that everything is wonderful. I don't want to like also be a pessimist. It's just, life is kind of like, it's a bit of that journey. Like I guess if I were to give advice, I don't know, I was asked to give advice, but if I were to give advice, it's like you can sort of like kind of find what you're interested in. I like social science. I like how society works. I like to kind of figure out how I can make a contribution. I like to write. I like to teach. I like to research. I like to work with other people and teams. And it's sort of like find your skill set, find your passion, find how you can apply it, and just there's a lot of trial and error along the way. And as you said, yeah, like on social media, things can seem better than they are. Like I'm pretty content right now nowadays, but just like anybody, like career and everything has its ups and downs.
Well, that is fantastic, man. Really appreciate the broad overview there, and I think your sort of notion here that life happens and that you don't
Mhm.
always necessarily know what to expect. I think a few, couple of decades involved in this kind of thing, and I really appreciate your notion here of wanting to find a way to make sort of a tangible contribution, as opposed to perhaps being a professional researcher, which is sort of the traditional goal of an academic or sort of doctoral program of study once it's over, right? So you've done a pretty commendable job
Oh,
of
thank you.
finding a spot that's comfortable for you and sort of working outwards in terms of finding a place of position and influence within that.
Oh,
So,
thank you.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. And again, this is sort of where as much, I don't know, contempt isn't the right word, but
Mm.
suspicion I have of like these social media platforms. I really, I don't know that on the whole they're necessarily helpful, but I do know that they're what we have right now for certain kinds of communication. And I guess I would just say that, like, given, for me, I mean, you lived various different places. I mean, you lived in what, Ontario for a
Mhm.
while when you were doing your study. Now you're out in BC. I mean, I've jumped around a fair bit
Mhm.
myself. So I think one of the affordances, one of the benefits of, the Zuckerberg effect,
Mhm.
if we can call it that, is that people who were in middle school once upon a time
Mhm.
are able to kind of find out what people are up to, and in some cases find things of interest, areas of commonality that might not have necessarily been there at the time, right? So
Mhm.
this is part of why I appreciate the opportunity to having these kinds of conversations. Now, just in as much as this is a sort of a guest lecture for some students on equity, diversity, and inclusion. First of all, I did not want to just put myself out there as sort
Mhm.
of this middle class, CIS white dude who just has, like, I've got some things to say about diversity, everybody. I kind of do, and I kind of have some lived experience, but I also just felt like, okay, in terms of somebody who's really super smart and is familiar with the BC post-secondary context, and who has lived experience as what? I mean, somebody who comes from a cultural background, New Brunswicker through and through, but
Mhm.
nevertheless, your family were first generation newcomers to Canada. Is
Yeah.
that the case, Sam?
Yeah, my parents were
Again,
immigrants.
I mean, not to say let's just talk about strictly all that, but again, I think just relative to the subject at hand, growing up as somebody of a cultural diversity within whitewashed,
Mhm.
conservative, straight-laced kind of Fredericton, more or less, right, in the 80s and 90s. I mean, that must not
Yeah.
have been without certain challenges, right? Again, just to sort of pick that part of it up, did you want to perhaps speak to what that was like back in the day, or not really?
I can sort of talk about like how times have changed from then. Like
Yes.
I noticed like, like for instance today in British Columbia and even in New Brunswick, like too, like New Brunswick, I mean British Columbia, I would say does have more experience of diversity and stuff, but like we've seen the change of both places. There's been an influx in New Brunswick as well, but I like it seems like it feels today like the onus nowadays is on the majority population to kind of understand and accommodate different minorities, which is a good thing, by the way.
For
And
sure.
for sure, like, like you'll see like happy Ramadan posts on like the government of BC website. I saw it on the New Brunswick Liberal Party Facebook page and stuff. Where I feel like in the 80s and 90s in Fredericton, it almost felt the other way around. It was like as minorities, it's almost you wanted to downplay it because you had to accommodate the majority in a way. That was more the dynamic back then. like, and as I said, I don't know what Victoria was like in the 80s and 90s. I just know New Brunswick in that era. There was definitely a lot of like, you don't necessarily I mean, obviously I don't look like a white person, but you may not advertise, being Muslim or being of Pakistani background too much. You kind of have a sense to downplay it. Like in my elementary school, for instance, they had a pizza day and they only had pepperoni pizza. And like, like I don't eat pork, but it's like at the time you just kind of accepted it as normal, where today it's like, that would be like kind of, I think it would be actually considered a big incident now. So yeah, there was definitely a different dynamic then. I think that's how I could kind of describe it in kind of a more broad brush
Awesome.
sense. Yeah. And so, yeah, there's definitely that different dynamic between then and now. And yeah, as I said, like, I mean, it doesn't mean like racism is gone now. It's just kind of a bit more underneath the surface. Like in New Brunswick, it can be a little bit more overt. I find sometimes in BC, it can be like sometimes, I'm not like one of those anti-politically correct types. I think it's
Yeah.
good to learn and listen and understand other cultural backgrounds, but sometimes people can become very performative and it can almost be a bit patronizing. For instance, like you do the land acknowledgement, but I saw one person who did really well. It's like she also talked a bit about the history of the land and stuff, like when it comes to Indigenous people. And I mean, so that would be, so it's like, sometimes nowadays it can be a bit more performative, and maybe there's sometimes, yeah, like there needs to be a bit more of that substance, if that makes any sense.
100%. I completely appreciate what you're saying there. And in as much as, like, yeah, it's like, well, let's do indigenization
Hmm.
by putting a, acknowledgement wording on the footer of my email.
Yeah.
Uh, and let's just make sure that the meeting that we have sort of speaks to that. But there's a difference between doing that with sincerity and with sort of as an opportunity to grow and engage, as opposed to just perfunctory, performative. Check, we got equity
Hmm.
now. We got diversity now. Hooray for us.
Hmm.
So I definitely, again, so this is where like my, I guess, not biases, but where my, what appears to me is just, I can see this stuff from sort of a higher level and just go, okay, this is a phenomena. But as a person who is not racialized, as a person who is not of a cultural, linguistic, or any kind of minority, I'm just like, okay, just kind of rolling along.
Hmm.
Whereas I think the way that these kinds of interactions or false or insincere, I mean, that's the insidious parts of racism and other kinds of isms, is that they, when they're being called out on the surface, they just go, okay, well, it's structural. We're just going to keep the
Hmm.
structural stuff and put on this window dressing and sort of carry on as we have in the past, really. So again, this is part of the value, I think, in having somebody other than just me up
Hmm.
here trying to speak to some of this stuff. So really appreciate the perspective there, bud.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, man. So I guess where I would then want to go, in as much as
Oh, I can't hear you.
teaching
Oh, so
experiences,
sorry, sorry. Can
particularly,
I stop you? You kind of blinked out for a
please do.
bit.
Oh, pardon me. Okay. Well,
Just repeat the
appreciate
question.
that. Yeah, yeah. I guess I would say then, as you've worked in a few different teaching situations, would you perhaps like to speak to each of those relative to, I guess, your overall career, right? I mean, you did some work at UNB. You've done work in a few different spots, including with UVic. So since you started as an educator, what have you noticed, and how does that stack up to where things are now?
like just in general, like overall
In
trends, you mean?
general, yeah, and perhaps with the EDI sort of lens as well.
Okay, EDI. Yeah, okay, EDI. Sorry, what does EDI stand for again? And I know you said
Well,
that.
that's the equity, diversity, and inclusion aspects of it. Yeah.
Okay, for sure. Yeah. Like I would say, like I mean, I started teaching at the University of New Brunswick, definitely at the time, like in the 2010s, like the student body was comparatively less diverse than the University of Victoria. Although I mean, comparatively, Victoria is not considered as multicultural as Vancouver.
Okay.
And I would say, I mean, I'm trying to think what's changed. Like I know I mean, I'm just trying to think like some of the changes. I know the biggest change like during the pandemic was like more online learning and stuff.
Okay.
And although I did like the public admin online before the pandemic. So definitely like, like trying to engage students through different mediums, like in person and online. And I would say like from an equity standpoint, like in British Columbia, where there's a comparatively more diverse student body in Victoria. Definitely, I think with the students, it's like I felt like in New Brunswick, like when I was teaching there, like at the time, the conversation was a little bit one way, like the students were listening to me and stuff. Whereas in BC, I felt like some of students of racialized background would sort of bring some of their experiences into the class discussion and stuff. So there's kind of maybe a bit more like I would say now like there's maybe a little bit more like on equity, the diversity and inclusion. It's not just about like kind of talking and lecturing. It's also about kind of facilitating that conversation, listening to different perspectives. Like I know you said that, like, yeah, I'm a white cisgendered male, but even for me, like, for instance, I don't, like I wouldn't bring the perspectives of women, for instance. I wouldn't bring the perspective of someone from the LGBTQ community. I wouldn't bring the perspective of someone from an indigenous background. And really, like, I mean, this goes beyond education, even in work situations. And sorry, I guess it's okay to get a little off topic,
No,
right?
please, man. Please. This is all good. I appreciate this a lot. Keep going, sir.
Yeah, because like in work situations too, it's like it's not just like, one person lecturing on like equity, diversity, and inclusion, but like say in a work situation where you have a team, like encouraging different people to speak up, to be heard. And in the classroom, like listening to the stories of different people, different perspectives that I may not have and stuff. Like, even like I mean, I know like even two white middle class males will have very different perspectives. Like I could talk to another white middle class male from Fredericton and they'd have a different perspective. I even as someone of South Asian background, I was born and raised in a smallish town, whereas someone like from Toronto or someone who's a first generation immigrant would have a different experience from me. So I think, I've definitely seen that in government. I think even in classrooms too, there's kind of that a bit more of an emphasis on kind of having that discussion on this issue and trying to incorporate the perspectives of other people into the teaching. Like, encourage like, if the students feel comfortable to speak up in class on these issues and have kind of more of that conversation and dialogue so that it's not all one way. Or like, in a lot of organizations still at the highest levels, it's still kind of more white and male as you get higher up. So it's not just, like, encourage people to seek more senior positions, but even if just encourage them to speak up in meetings and like have people have a comfortable place to talk about if they feel like something is uncomfortable or even a little offensive. Like we all kind of have our ingrained biases and stuff. We're all capable of saying something that can be insensitive and stuff, and to just try to hear other people on that and try to have that dialogue. So
That is awesome, man. And there's a few aspects of what you were just describing that I think really resonate here. So I guess the first of which is your implicit point there that educational settings and contexts are definitely an aspect of the wider culture. And
mhm.
so noting that generational or demographic changes within, like, to say, well, strictly within higher ed. I mean, that's it is to speak of it within the culture generally. I appreciate as well your strong emphasis that every individual is an individual, and such that whether it's a matter of implicit cultural or whatever kind of biases, everybody, regardless of where they're from, regardless of, again, demographic, cultural background, or whatever, is going to come to a situation with those. So I think it behooves administrators, managers, people at the sort of upper levels, not those necessarily even within the teaching realm, but to provide meaningful opportunities and spaces for these kind of dialogues and interactions, which ultimately benefit all of us, to occur. So I guess I wonder, given your significant background as somebody who studied government institutional policies and mandates, I guess I wonder if there are any particular frameworks, or if there are any particular, sets of resources that you've encountered within your career, whether as an academic or within your working life, that have been helpful in that regard. Like any frameworks or books or websites or anything that's kind of jumped out at you, sir?
Well, I know in British Columbia right now, like reconciliation with First Nations is a big cross-cutting theme in policy and legislation. Like we have the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which mandates that legislation across the province be amended to fulfill the goals of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. So in terms of like educational resources, like within the BC government, I mean, this is kind of internal, but it can apply also externally, like, through the Law Society of BC. I do find like on the reconciliation, like it's easy to just kind of get into conversations with a bunch of people, whether they're public servants, whether it's in academia, who are not Indigenous, and we're talking about like reconciliation. So I find it's important to try to like seek out like the kind of courses and resources that are provided by Indigenous people, because I mean, these are the people, this is Indigenous people. Like, I mean, I'm not going to get into the history is horrific and we're learning more and more about it, but like, we want to hear their perspective. Like, how do they feel about reconciliation? How do they feel about policy and academia? And so, it's kind of maybe ties into my earlier point. It's really kind of important to like kind of not to kind of get out of our bubbles and stuff. And so like that's kind of more in a general sense through the Law Society of BC, through the government of British Columbia. In terms of like kind of resources in general on equity, diversion, and inclusion, like I can't think of anything. I'm just trying to think right now. Like, I mean, I know like when I've taught like sociology of law and public administration, like I mean, very imperfectly and in a very limited sense, I've tried to, like when I taught, include some like, quote unquote diverse perspectives. I feel like there's a better word for that I should be using. But like when I taught sociology of law, I included, when I talked about like kind of some of the thought around law and society, I included, both when I taught at the University of New Brunswick and University of Victoria, I included a reading by Ibn Khaldun, who is a 14th century Arab historian who's considered kind of one of the earliest sociologists, Arab Islamic historian. So just that I'm not, talking about like, say, like, like Locke and Hobbes and, dead white men.
Or whomever, yeah.
Yeah, like try to, like in those historical backgrounds, try not to talk just about dead white guys, get the voices of like leading feminists, of like thinkers outside Europe. And I mean, as I said, I did it in albeit a very limited sense. I kind of wanted to draw on what I know, but I tried to do that. I had a unit on family law where I talked about the evolution And just like I would say it's worth reading the commentaries on the Supreme Court case. My mind just went blank. It was in, I forget the name of it, and I've talked about it a ton of times. I hate it when that happens, but
It's okay, pal.
it's in the 70s,
Yep.
and it's about an Alberta ranch wife. Like, she was getting divorced from her husband, separated, divorced, and it went to the Supreme Court. And basically what it was is, in terms of dividing the property, like, she wanted the fact that all the work she did on the ranch would count towards the division of the property, and the Supreme Court found against that and just gave her kind of a very minimal allowance. And that led to, very rightly, a large uproar. Eventually, the Law Reform Commission of Canada reformed the laws around separation and around separation of property to recognize both, salaried and unsalaried work. So, including that kind of history. And, you go back to 19th century Canada, it's like when a woman got married, like, all her property became her husband's property. And sometimes, we can look at some countries around the world and say, oh my God, it's right to have these conversations that, the state of the rights of women, or the rights of LGBTQ people in a lot of other countries around the world. But we have to remember, Canada is relatively recent to a lot of these, like a Murdoch versus Murdoch. That's the case from the 1970s I was thinking of. Sorry, I blanked on that. But
awesome.
But yeah, it's so looking at that, look at the comment, look up at that case, look up the commentary on it, look at the evolution of family law. So that was some of the topics I included in my sociology of law course, just to show, law and society, who are the different people that have thought about it? What's been the impact on racialized people, on women, and also to realize, there's a lot. Canada is a great country. I'm proud of Canada, but Canadians can get very self-righteous. It's not that long ago that Canada had some very, just on women's rights, on minority rights. We're finding out about the residential schools and stuff. So we can't, when we're talking about what's going on in other countries, we have to remember we're pretty recent on a lot of this stuff, in the 20th century and stuff, on recognizing a lot of these rights. So that's kind of getting into some of the resources there. And when I taught urban and regional economic development in the School of Public Admin, actually the first year I taught it, that course, the sociology of law and society, political sociology, those I designed. This one was a course that was already designed. It was an online course for primarily public servants. And I found the first year I taught it, it didn't have anything on reconciliation, didn't have anything on immigration and diversity. So the second year I taught it, I actually added some of that material into it, because reconciliation is the cross-cutting goal of the BC government. So I included some readings from Indigenous writers on on aspects of economic development and urban development, urban urban Indigenous people, for example. I included some conversation on immigration and diversity, both the opportunities of immigration, but also some of the prejudices immigrants can, and barriers immigrants can face when they come here. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question. I sort of went all over the place.
That's really fantastic, Hassan. And it's I guess a few of the things that have jumped out at me there is that in terms of how to, I guess, bring about a positive change vis-a-vis teaching action, is that I was going to ask you, well, what strategies and things like that, but you've already jumped to that by sort of taking a full sort of scope of the possible curriculum and choosing deliberately to include voices, perspectives that are historically not recognized. The peoples who are not among the dead white guys club. So I think that just choosing to broaden your curriculum out of a necessity to speak to contemporary lived experience in Canada in the 21st century, and to possibly redress some of the absences and enforce silence and of various non-white voices is just really, and non-male voices is just really impressive, and that's to your credit.
Oh,
so I think that's awesome. And folks, I didn't know these particulars about Dr. Arif's background as an educator, but I knew enough from Facebook to be like, okay, this guy is on the right side of a lot of issues that I tend to value, which is kind of how one of the reasons that I approached Hassan, besides the fact that I knew that he would bring a legalistic kind of perspective. So you, again, I think where you are really bringing value here, Bud, to the
thank you.
Lecture and also to general practice, is that you have this awareness of policies, acts, law, which have led to the present moment, and further to that, you have that experience as an educator and as somebody with lived experience within a cultural minority, shall we say, again, for lack of an appropriately an appropriate term. So I guess then when you talk about sort of factors that have sort of caused you to take a bit of a break or stepping away a bit from the academic kind of role, I guess, is that sort of an intentional aspect, just to pursue other opportunities? I kind of know you alluded to that, but I guess, was there anything else that sort of informed that decision above and beyond, I guess, professional interest, if I could put it that way?
Well, I would say, like, in recent years, like when I first moved to British Columbia, I was teaching sociology of law, urban and regional economic development, and working in the public service. So just very heavy workload, to be honest. I kind of overwhelmed myself a bit. Like, I was in a new place and wanted to take advantage of everything. So I eventually reduced it to just teaching the urban and regional economic development. And just kind of in the last few months, to be honest, it's just been more about kind of, I'm kind of been in BC for a little bit longer. I'm in the public service, and I'm just kind of looking to move around, maybe even, everyone wants to climb the ladder and stuff. And so it can be kind of hard to teach and do that at the same time. So it's kind of just more, for the time being, I'm just focusing a bit more on the public service career side of things. I hope at some point to like kind of return back to teaching. Like it was a voluntary thing. I decided I still have the adjunct position, but I didn't apply to teach this year. And like, I mean, even longer term, like as I said, like I was saying, like, you never know what direction you'd take. Like I'd be open even at some point in the future, maybe teaching public administration full time. Although I wanted to probably teach, I've kind of grown to like Victoria a lot. Like the weather here is really nice, and the mountains and the ocean. That's now like the disincentive. I know it's not the most.
I've seen some of your pictures, of cherry blossoms and whatnot from Victoria, and I'm just here in uptown St. John going, yeah, we got a lot of rain, we got a lot of fog, stuff too, but we're lacking in the cherry blossoms department, I gotta say. So that is totally legit, what you described. I guess what I would sort of wonder is, in as much as teaching and I think public service is sort of, there's a lot when it's going well of mentoring and sort of coaching above and beyond strictly just the dissemination of policies or information or whatnot. Do you have, I suppose, as kind of a gambit as we sort of wind down here in the last 5 or 10 minutes, do you have any advice for any individuals who might be sort of going into law or public service or within BC, but generally? I mean, if you were to sort of look at some new professional individuals at an early stage of their career, such as the folks who might be in this class, just to sort of, things to check out or be mindful of from somebody who's had, some 15, 20 plus years working in various areas as a professional and as a teacher and as a writer too. Hassan wrote a really awesome column for the New Brunswick Telegraph Journal for quite a period, which I'm not paying for access to the TJ, sorry, but if I were, I believe that those columns would still be behind the firewall, so, but the paywall rather. But yeah, I mean, just anything to sort of speak to the next generation of professional and or academic up and comers, bud.
Oh, that's a very good question. And I said it's there's not a generic answer for as for instance, sometimes someone will be like, what is it like to be a lawyer? Is it a good job or a bad job? What is it like to be an academic? Is it good or bad? The truth is, it really depends on you. It depends on the person. So I can't necessarily say law is a great field to work in or run away, stay as far away as possible. Same with academia, same as government. It's really I mean, for lack of, I was talking earlier, I had a fair bit of trial and error. I had my share of ups and downs career-wise. You'll have good supervisors and good teams, bad supervisors and bad teams. All I can say, I'd say the best advice is at one level, find out what interests you, what you have the aptitude for, figure out how to apply it in some way. I mean, there's the practical thing. We want to earn a salary and get a house and buy a car and stuff. So there's some practical necessity to that, but kind of figure out how to apply it and, work hard, not too hard. Work-life balance isn't important. That's something I've had to learn over the years. I alluded to that a bit earlier. I can be a bit of a workaholic. So I still want to be busy and make a contribution, but I have deliberately slowed myself down a bit just to kind of, stop and smell the roses, or in my case, the cherry blossoms out here in British Columbia. And so, yeah, I'd say don't be afraid to take a few calculated risks. Don't get discouraged by failure. There will be successes and failures. And yes, Facebook, you may get an overly optimistic view of how everyone else is doing, but it's just that kind of, a good work ethic with the work-life balance, figuring out what you're good at, learning how to apply that, and just trying out different, taking an undergrad, you can take courses in a lot of different areas. You can, maybe even at the law school, they might let you sit in on a law class, or at least you can maybe go to the law library, see what some of the books are there, get it, networking, making friends, talking to different people, finding out what different fields and professions are like, and just kind of figuring out what's best for you. And that's kind of it. As I said, I can't give sort of the level advice that, oh yeah, law is great or law is terrible or academia is great or academia is terrible. But that would be kind of, the general advice. I can say I know a lot of people talk about this current trend of AI, and I mean, I just use the thing as a toy to entertain myself, with weird stories or see what are the most absurd prompts and stuff. But I'm honestly not really sure what the implications of that are yet. I mean, it's definitely putting some computer programmers out of work. I mean, and I've kind of played around with it in terms of trying to write, put in some prompts and write an academic essay. And I can say the quality of the academic essays are coherent, but they're not great. I think still you need that human judgment, human values, and dealing with especially there's always these contentious issues and debates as we kind of figure out how to build a better society, how to live together and stuff. So it's easy to over or underestimate the impact of AI, but I felt like I had to bring it up because everyone's talking about it. So,
well, that's fantastic, man. And honestly, that fits very well into the mandate of the Ed Non-Tech podcast, to the extent that Dr. Doug Reed and I have gone into this variously and shall do. I think from the perspective of students who are sort of in an EDI course in education, I think to speak to the implicit biases of generative and emerging generative AI platforms. I mean, if you're looking at a corpus of language for a large language model output, I think a lot of the biases of the wider online culture, i.e., largely male, largely privileged, largely white voices from Silicon Valley, which have built the current internet, which we experience, I think those biases are just simply going to be replicated in ways through AI outputs, whether textual, which you've alluded to, or visual. Folks, this is what downtown Fredericton looked like in the 80s, according to Bing AI. So I think you're quite right to point out that we simply don't know the full extent of the effects that generative AI outputs and the paradigm are going to have for us. So to anybody who's out there checking it out, I think a critical standpoint and a willingness to try and experiment are certainly valuable. And to the extent that we're able to sort of provide some safe instances of that through this show, some whimsical instances, I just think that's a really cool function of what we're able to speak to here. So Hassan, I really, really deeply appreciate the opportunity to get to check in with you in a conversational kind of setting. Really deeply appreciative of your willingness to sort of share some of your experiences, significant professional experiences, and also some of your lived personal experience as an academic, as somebody who works in various capacities within the public service. Honestly, I am very grateful that you were willing to have this conversation under these circumstances. And I just really wanted to say thank you, man, and to just sort of add if there's anything else you wanted to speak to before we sign off. I'd give you that moment there, bud.
Oh, thank you. Well, first, I wanted to thank you actually for the opportunity to speak both to the class and to your podcast in general. So thank you for inviting me, and it was great. It's actually great. I don't know when. I think it's been like, I saw you in Fredericton like 10, 15 years ago, and I think that's the last time I even like heard your voice. So instead of like Facebook images and chat, so it's nice to hear from you and talk to you and stuff. And I guess maybe on the one additional topic, I'll do a bit of a sort of reminisce of like middle school and high school, like when we were talking about like inclusive education and like kind of inclusive story. Like both of us went to like Albert Middle School and Fredericton High School. And like a lot of the history classes we took, it was basically like, we learned about Greece, Rome, then there was the Dark Ages, then there was the Renaissance, and then there was like the French Revolution and stuff. And then there was like the colonization of the Americas. And like we learned a very limited history. Like for instance, with Indigenous people, they did teach in our middle school about like the Beothuk people being like killed off entirely in Newfoundland. They did talk a bit about the disease, but I don't remember, maybe you recall, I don't remember hearing a thing about residential schools, and they didn't tell us the extent of the disease that it killed like 90 to 95% of the Indigenous population. So like they told us about some of it, but they didn't tell us the full extent of the destruction. And
these are some things that happened, right? Historic actors at the time who didn't know it, and I completely like terming, I mean, the history that gets left out or got left out during our time is just overwhelmingly loud in terms of just what doesn't get recognized. And so I think, honestly, Hassan, as you sort of described and alluded to, just the best thing you can do is know yourself, recognize that wherever you are, whoever you are, there's somebody who is more privileged than you and who definitely does not have any level of the same privileges. And I think just to sort of be mindful of your own trajectory and growth as an individual, to seek out other voices and perspectives, not just because they deserve to be recognized, but because they can actually enrich your inner life and the lives of all of us by sort of taking on these perspectives. So, Hassan, it has been an absolute pleasure. Dr. Arif, I have really seriously enjoyed this opportunity to speak with you. Hopefully the students, I'm sure the students watching this and Dr. Pam Gurney all were going to feel similarly about this. And just really great talking to you, pal. And thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you. So thank you again for inviting me. This was great.
Absolutely, pal. I'm going to end the recording now. Take care, everybody, and bye for now.
Bye.